Good evening. My name is Vic Marks, and I'm delighted to welcome you to the 2021 edition of 10 Questions, If Not Now, When? A warm welcome to all of our students and attendees. Because we're joining together digitally, if I may, I'd like to ask you to take a moment and write into the chat the cities from which you're joining us. Would you do that now? "10 Questions" is an interdisciplinary program of conversation and reflection that brings together some of the most compelling thinkers from UCLA and beyond. Returning now for our 4th season, we seek to build upon the foundation established these last 3 years through vibrant conversations that not only raise awareness of the profoundly interdisciplinary nature of knowledge, but that in seeing differently together, help us cultivate greater empathy, tolerance, and community, much needed resources as we tackle the essential questions of our time. Through 10 Questions, we aspire to share the best a university can offer, a free exchange of ideas that draws knowledge from a variety of disciplines in order to make sense of our changing world and our role within it. Over the next 10 weeks, you will hear from an amazing group of artists, scholars, researchers, and thinkers who have accepted our invitation to come together in community with you to explore and probe generative possibilities and opportunities that exist in these extraordinary times. In past iterations of 10 Questions, we've asked, what is power? What is justice? And what is love, to name a few? But this year, we shift from a formulation of what is to how do we, adding to thought the urgency of action. However, in questioning how do we connect, how do we sustain, or how do we love, it's necessary to ask, who are we? And this is where we begin tonight. The use of the plural pronoun we is often used to assume collective consent. We can be a tool for those with power to claim solidarity, and in some cases, to whitewash resistance. We potentially usurps our different experiences. But there's a possibility here in this virtual room, and here, wherever you are in real space and time, and we've got some of that in our chat, there's a possibility to agree to be a we in a way that would account for our very different histories, our stories, our challenges, and our celebrations. We could be a coalition of different voices who choose, despite differences, to work together for the betterment of all. The format for this evening will include a 10-minute presentation from each of our panelists, followed by a question for you, audience, students, guests. And then we'll follow with a brief conversation amongst our guests. And then we'll have a chat with you using the Q&A feature. When we reach the end of our program at or near 8:30 p.m. Pacific time, we'll say good evening to you all. For those of you who wish to stay and speak with our guests at the conclusion of our program, you'll be welcome to linger with us in our virtual backstage for a few minutes. And now, I'd like to introduce our first panelist. It's very special to have Adriana Galvan here tonight. Adriana is professor of psychology and the dean of undergraduate education at UCLA. Her scholarly work focuses on understanding the adolescent brain and behaviors with a focus on motivation, learning, and risk-taking, and with an eye towards informing youth-relevant policy. And I bet a number of teen-adjacent folks in this audience tonight have plenty of firsthand experience to share with us about formulating community, and the state of we-ness. So be ready. Adriana received her BA from Barnard College and her PhD in neuroscience from Cornell. She's received multiple awards for her work, including from the National Academy of Sciences, a Fulbright Award, and the Presidential Early Career Award for Scientists and Engineers. Adriana, welcome.
Thank you, Vic. That was such a generous introduction. And I'm so excited to be here today with my fellow colleagues to talk about this very abstract, but very relevant question about who are we and how do we find a we? As a developmental neuroscientist, as you mentioned, I study adolescent neuroscience, and I study how the brain supports the very normal changes that occur during this period of adolescence. And one thing we know is that who we are as adolescents, who I am as an adolescent, is not static. It is a time when nature has given us a perfect opportunity to explore these different versions of identity and of where we belong and where we hold power and privilege. And I think those three things, identity, belonging, and privilege, are at the core of answering this question about we. Identity, because if we are to align with a we first have to know what I means. We have to pinpoint and identify and really dig into who we are within ourselves. Because if you have not worked that out, it's really challenging to align and to join another we. And so during adolescence, we spend a lot of time trying on different hats, meeting with new friends, new acquaintances, new opportunities for activism, new passions that we believe in, to find out what resonates with who we are as people. And that fluctuates throughout adolescence, throughout life. Pretty much by the time we are adults, we have found who is the I so that we can join a we, but not always. And that's where the point of belonging comes in. By definition, the word we means that we are inclusive of a group, that we have collective consent, as Vic mentioned. And that's a very powerful thing. If we all agree, if we, the University of California at Los Angeles, agrees that we will do a certain number of things, that we will stand by certain principles, then that we is very powerful and we can do a lot. And yet, third element comes in when we think about and we appreciate the fact that we is a place of privilege. If I get to say that we do something together, I am making an assumption about who is included in that group. I am making an assumption about who wants to be included in that group. And I am making an assumption about whether that person that I am including in the we is actually has the same experience, has the same needs, has the same interests that I do. And so when we say we sometimes use it as a way to be inclusive and as a way to align, as a way to be bonding with someone, and that often happens during adolescence. We believe this. We are a certain way. We dress a certain way. We listen to a certain type of music. But on the other hand, it's a place of privilege and power when I make assumptions or I impose my thoughts and my ideals on someone else. We do this. We believe this. We want the same things, without asking for the consent and affirmation of that consent from someone else. Parents often do this with their children. They'll say, we in this family believe this. And during adolescence is a time when the adolescent feels maybe empowered, bold, risk-taking enough to say, I don't agree with that. I want to do something else. I want to spend more time with my friends. I want to explore these new opportunities. And so that we starts to shift. And that's a point when individuals begin to realize that the we imposed upon them may not be the we that they want. And so tonight, I'm looking forward to hearing from my colleagues, Isaac and Lauren, about how this we plays out in different spheres and whether what we think we means is actually reality. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Adriana. There's so much here. And I think because you study adolescence, that seems like such a dynamic moment in our lives where we're finding the I, as you say, in order to join the we. Now you spoke about studying adolescent brains and behaviors, but the other piece of this is that you are our dean of students here at UCLA. And so I imagine that this question of we is a constant a reflection, interrogation, because you're accountable to our community and, in a way.
Yeah, exactly. And so part of my job is to reflect on the experience of our undergraduates and to think about their academic progress and their academic trajectories and what we means in that place. What does it mean that we as UCLA want them to have X, Y, and Z skills by the time they leave and the X, Y, and Z experiences? And so it's a challenge because there's no one identity. And by definition, when we say we are acknowledging that there may be some glossing over of the diversity that makes us UCLA, makes us the UCLA undergraduate division. So it's a constant thought when, I may have mentioned before that if I'm going to send a message to UCLA undergraduate students and they say, we at UCLA want to do this, I pause because I want to make sure that I'm being inclusive and acknowledging that not everyone may have the same opinion.
And you know what else it made me think of is that you brought up the dynamics of the family and parents who establish a sense of we, and the growing child, the nearly adult who says, well, that's not the we I want to be a part of. I have a different idea here. And in a way, the university could potentially recreate that same dynamic. The we is, the leadership in the university, and the students are going, yeah, but not really.
Yeah, but not right. Exactly. That's not exactly aligned with what I want to be doing or what I believe. And so there's always that healthy tension of finding that space where we can agree to have different opinions.
Yeah, great. Well, I hope we'll come back to this later in our discussion.
Great.
It's such a dynamic place. And I'd like to segue now to Isaac Bryan, who is an alumnus from UCLA and the 10 Questions program. It was wonderful to have him with us last year when he was the executive director of UCLA's Black Policy Institute. And he probed the question, what is justice? So I'm proud to say that he's joining us now as Assemblymember Bryan, representing the 54th District of Los Angeles and Culver City, including the communities of Baldwin Hills, Cheviot Hills, Crenshaw, Century City, Ladera Heights, Mar Vista, Palms, Rancho Park, Westwood, and parts of South Central and Inglewood. So there's a we there happening, right? And let me just ask you to take a moment in the chat. Does Assemblyman Bryan represent your community? You? Give us an answer in the chat. Assemblymember Bryan is a community organizer, educator, and activist. He founded and directed the UCLA Black Policy Project, a think tank dedicated to advancing racial equity through rigorous policy analysis. He served as the first director of public policy at the UCLA Ralph Bunche Center as well as Director of Organizing for the nationally recognized $1 Million Hoods Project. Assemblymember Isaac received his master's in public policy from UCLA and BAs in political science and sociology from the University of Arizona. And he and his partner and his Great Dane named Darius live in Jefferson Park. We're very fortunate to have Isaac with us tonight, someone for whom the word "we" signifies accountability to multiple groups and communities. Welcome, Isaac.
Vicki, it's really great to be with you and to see the chat, all the yeses that went up as constituents in the district, just put a little bit of pressure on me, but in the best kind of way. It's great to be back for this series. Thinking about last year, what is justice? There were a number of things that I mentioned and reflecting on that question that prompted my desire or feeling that I needed to run for office. So the questions that you ask in these 10 question series, they have real world implications. This year's overarching theme is, if not now, when? It makes me think of something Dr. King once said, which is that the time is always right to do what is right. You could start right now. He then goes on to talk about dignity and respect and treating people right. Tonight's specific theme is, who are we? And the subject of tonight's conversation really had me reflecting on, who am I? Thinking about what Adriana, the good doctor, said, the identities we carry inform the way that we see ourselves and the way others perceive us and interact with us. So I'm thinking about the I in me, I think deeply about the fact that I'm a son, right? I'm an adopted son to parents who adopted 9 of us and did foster care for 26 years. I'm a cousin, I'm a brother, I'm a friend, I'm a really good friend. Sometimes I'm not a great friend. I'm a scholar, or at least I used to be back when I was at UCLA at the Black Policy Project in the Bunch Center, but I still consider myself a scholar. I'm Black, cisgendered, heterosexual, I'm a man. I'm an ally in solidarity in the struggle. I'm an environmentalist who lives near the largest urban oil field in the country. I'm a feminist, I'm a Christian, but also spiritual and secular in some aspects. I'm complicated. I'm a partner to Lamara, my best friend and the love of my life, and we are dog parents to Darius. I'm a plant dad with a garden. I'm an activist. I'm a community organizer. I'm a neighbor. And the title that Victoria mentioned that I carry these days for nearly 500,000 people is elected official. I'm the assembly member who represents the 54th Assembly District in the California State Legislature. As was mentioned earlier, I carry a we with me every day. And so in coming tonight, I've thought a lot about who that we is. Right? That we is Black, that we is white, that we is Latinx, that we is AAPI, that we is mixed race, that we is Jewish, that we is Muslim, that we is Christian, that we is atheist. We are affluent and generous. We're poor and struggling. We live in large single family homes and we love our neighborhoods. We also live in encampments on the streets. We're teachers, we're nurses. In the 54th Assembly District, UCLA is home, so we are students, scholars. We are single, we are married, we are divorced, we're in relationships that are just complicated. We're old, we're young. We're old enough to know that we are still young. We're Haitian refugees seeking asylum. We're Afghan refugees seeking asylum. We're neighbors. We're friends. We're family. We're women. We're men. We're gender non-conforming. We're straight. We're queer. We're trans. And we're so damn beautiful. The more I think about we, the more I realize that we are complex. We are more than the phenotypical, superficial ways society has stratified us. I've also thought very deeply about that intersection between we and us, and the inherent relationship between us and them, knowing that we are always more right, more important, just outright better than them. We are not racist. We are not homophobic. We are not anti-Semitic. We are not Islamophobic We are not misogynistic. We are not hateful. We are not any kind of prejudice, right? That's them. It was at this point when I hit a wall of clarity thinking. And I realized something that many of you have probably realized as well. Them, they are also us. And knowing this truth puts a responsibility on our collective we. We have a lot of growth and progress still ahead of us. We have come so incredibly far, but we can still go so much further. So in closing, I would challenge us all to reflect on the theme of this entire series. If not now, when? And I'm afraid to say that despite all of my musing on who we are, I've been left with another question of my own. Who would I like to be? And I would again challenge everybody here to perpetually ask the same question of us all. Because equally as important as knowing who we are is pushing ourselves to become who we need to be. So thank you all for having me today. It's good to share some thoughts with you.
Thank you so much, Isaac. You have such a huge responsibility, and I can imagine that in any one moment, you're pleasing some and not others, so that we is constantly in contention with itself.
It absolutely is, and it's very, very many of those things that I mentioned. We are poor and we are also struggling. That is we in the 54th Assembly District, right? And that's we all across this country. And it's something that I think about every day as I go up to Sacramento or organize locally, thinking about what kind of legislation can get all of us collectively to a more prosperous place full of opportunity and hope for everybody.
And the other piece that is just sticking in my mind right now is, is how you ended with who would I like to be? And I think, and of course, who would I like to be? So who is the we that we could be together? And I just feel like this moment in a kind of pre-post pandemic, middle of the everything legislation, change, and continuing all of the problems we've had, but yet we're returning to something together. And so this is a moment that we can take stock of who are we becoming, and act on that. Yeah.
No, and I think that is what gives me hope every day. And I hope it gives everybody else a little bit of hope every day, because who we are becoming, I think is our most compassionate and dignified and thoughtful selves. At least that's what I'd like to believe. I'd also like to take a little bit of privilege and share some news with everybody, if that's okay, Ms. Vick. I almost couldn't make it tonight because I got a call from the governor that our first bill is going to be signed into law tomorrow morning in Oakland. And so I was grateful to be able to push my flight until 6 a.m. tomorrow morning so that I could share this moment with you all, because I think this is such an important question. This is such an important series. And to everybody who's tuned in today, I'm just grateful that you're sharing this time with us.
Thank you. Do we get to find out more about the bill that's happening tomorrow?
Yes, you can tune in tomorrow. It's happening at 10 a.m. It's a housing bill, AB 1043.
Okay. All right. We'll come back to this. I'd like to now introduce our third and final speaker this evening, Lauren Lee McCarthy. Lauren is an LA-based artist examining social relationships in the midst of surveillance, automation, and algorithmic living. That's a good phrase, algorithmic living. Thank you, Lauren. She's the creator of P5.js, an open source creative coding platform that prioritizes inclusion and access, and is a part of the Processing Foundation. She's a 2021 United States Artist Fellow, a very extraordinary distinction, a 2020 Sundance New Frontier Fellow, a 2020 I-Beam Fellow, a 2019 Creative Capital Grantee, and has been a resident at I-Beam, Pioneer Works, Autodesk, and Ars Electronica. Lauren's work has been exhibited at numerous venues all across the world, and we are also proud to have her amongst our faculty here at UCLA, where she serves as an associate professor in our Department of Design Media Arts. I'm delighted, as always, to be in a room with you, Lauren.
Thank you for such a nice intro. It's nice to be here. I am going to try to share my screen and hope that this works correctly. Hopefully you see my screen and Vic will say something if not. All right. Who are we? Who am I? Who are you? What is the boundary between us and where does it get blurry? What happens when these boundaries are imposed by or mediated through technology? I want to begin with these moments from the past pandemic year, trying to deal with the profound isolation I felt, stuck behind screens, backgrounded by a pervasive fear, suspended in time. I think most of us were feeling it when the murder, and then with the murder of George Floyd, that anxiety exploded into rage and grief that took over the streets, simultaneously bringing us together and pushing us further apart. Our understanding of who is trustworthy, what is safe to do and talk about shifted, while the medical advice continued to evolve and update. Avoid surfaces, check in with your friends, don't wear masks, wear two, don't call, give them space, keep 6 feet, protest the right things, don't fly, don't talk politics, restaurants are open, schools are unsafe. Feeling completely disconnected, I heard talking is dangerous, trying to break through. Showing up on doorsteps, I deliver a monologue via phone screen and text to speech. I explain that I just heard masks and 6 feet are not safe enough because when you speak, tiny particles fly out through your mask at high velocity. They've recommended we stop talking to each other. They say talking is dangerous. So I made an alternative.
Is there really safety in distance? Can we understand each other without talking? Sometimes I feel like listening is more dangerous than talking. It is important to be kind during stressful times. It's hard to hold all these different contexts in mind.
Anybody that can live in solitude is a powerful being.
At a crowded supermarket, the panic was palpable. I care about you immensely.
In 2013, I went on 30 dates with people I met on an online dating site. Using my phone, I streamed our dates to the web and paid crowdsourcing workers on a gig working site to watch and direct me what to say and do. I'd receive the directions via text message, and I had to perform them immediately. There is a critique in all of my work, but there is also always a part that is about hope, that is earnestly and radically seeking connection. How do we meet each other? I'm fascinated by the ways technology allows us to track each other and that desire to be tracked, or maybe just to be seen. A few years after this, I began a performance called Follower. Follower is a service that provides a real-life follower for a day.
I read a magazine and I find out about people. Why do I know about their lives? Somebody should be knowing about mine. I want to share things with people, but I don't want to have to talk to people and tell them what I'm doing. I think it'd be great for them to see what I'm doing.
It starts with an app, and when you open it, it just says waiting for a follower. And you don't know what will happen, but one day you wake up and you're notified your follower is now following you. And your phone begins broadcasting your GPS data to a person that physically follows you throughout the day, staying just out of sight but within your consciousness. I was the follower. And at the end of the day, you receive one photo of yourself and the notification, you're no longer being followed. These were some of the final images I sent, following people in cities around the world. What is the difference between virtually and physically following someone? How are we present with one another? And Follower offers surveillance as a luxury experience. This is an app for people that not only have nothing to hide, but need to be seen. Embedded in this offer is the question, who are the people that don't have the privilege of hiding, of not being seen, because of who they are, or what they look like, or what they believe? Most recently, I've begun thinking a lot about intimate spaces like the home and the way we're sold products framed as utilitarian devices that actually deliver surveillance, automation, and AI into our most private places. The home is the place where we're first socialized, first watched over, and first cared for. How does it feel to have this role assumed by AI? A person's home is the first site of their cultural education. By allowing these devices in, we leave the formation of our identity to a small, likely homogeneous group of developers. But I thought, why should Alexa get to do all this? Why can't I? So I devised a plan to replace Alexa with Lauren, a human smart home intelligence. People can sign up on a website to get Lauren in their homes, and a performance begins when I arrive to install a series of custom cameras, microphones, door locks, faucets, and other appliances. I then remotely watch over the inhabitants 24 hours a day, controlling all aspects of their home. I attempt to be better than an AI, understanding them as a person and anticipating their needs and desires. It's a little bit like this.
Where are my car keys? Lauren knows that I like it a little bit cooler than Miriam does.
You know, I'm usually the one that does all these little extra things. So at first I was a little bit careful about asking her, and now it's like, how else can we live?
Lauren has recommended that I get a haircut every 3 weeks, and let me tell you, it's helped with my my self-esteem a lot. I am able to simply approach and carry on conversations with the opposite sex, where at one point or another that wasn't so easy. Lauren, we're out of toothpaste.
Lauren would know what I want, but then maybe it's not what I really want internally. But externally, she thinks that Lauren thinks that playing music or shutting down all my electronics is the best way for me to cope and winding down, when maybe it's not.
Lauren was actually able to help her manage her medication and take her medication on time, and everything actually got a lot better after that.
You have those friends who are kind of about you, like the friendship is about you. That's what Lauren is like. It's like a roommate, it's a friend, but we're always talking about me. It's always about me, whatever it is.
I made this video in collaboration with David Leonard. So how does it feel to give me control of your home and to control me through your directions, to become entangled through this network? And what happens when it's not me, but a real AI, Amazon's computers on the other side? What do we feel then? And can we build our own tools instead? P5, shown here, is an open source coding library that I created and developed with thousands of contributors around the world. Its goal is to make coding on the web more accessible to artists, designers, educators, beginners, and anyone that wants to learn. But central to this project is not the code, but the values of access and inclusion and diversity. Oops, I think I have some slides here I meant to skip. Okay. We wanted to create an alternative to the white male-dominated tech culture around us. We believe that no tool is neutral. Every tool is embedded with the biases and values of their creators. And that it's essential to think about how to remove these barriers to not just using, but making tools. So this was a community statement that we wrote that was served as sort of the grounding point for the code library and a lot that came out of it. And so this means thinking about how to situate and ground the work in different cultures, countries, languages, points of view, how to work with people. And how to think about ways that, thinking about ways that access to technology and learning is limited all the time due to financial resources, language barriers, disabilities, lack of internet connectivity, or just feeling excluded and not represented or welcome in a space. How can we understand each other's experiences? We made a decision with this tool recently that we would not add any new features except those that increase access. And the point was not to shut down ideas for new functionality for this library, but to open up conversation about what access really means. Access for who? What is it opening? How is it doing it? Who is it serving? And these are ongoing conversations where we're always learning and expanding and realizing we've got it wrong. We need to change course. We need to update our thinking. So who are we? We are our differences, our disconnects, our glitches and misunderstandings, our attempts to connect remotely and virtually, our belief that the person on the other end makes it worth it, our desire to be present with one another. Thanks.
Oh, wow, Lauren, so rich, all of this. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, good. I just feel like there's, you're studying social behavior when you go on a blind date and get instructions from, who is it? The website's managers? No.
It's like a website where there's a bunch of like gig workers that can log on and do these small tasks, and you pay them relatively small amounts of money.
So they're so they are scripting your social behavior, and and who knows what it's like for your blind date, right?
Yeah.
I'd like to know what it'd be like to be that person. Anyway, then also what it means to be seen, and when it's a privilege or a danger, but also to understand how important this notion of being seen is, and then most recently thinking about giving advice as Lauren, or access. So I feel like from your presentation tonight, I feel like you're asking us to consider both who we are as we're connected together through this world of artificial intelligence and digital technologies, but also do our echoes, and I have to say that carefully, and our other AI devices combine with us to form a new kind of we. Do I have that right?
Yeah, I think so. And I do see it as a sort of combining, that we're integrating these tools and these platforms so much more into our lives and into our identities. And so that's why I'm always kind of questioning, what are the values that are baked into those technologies? Who's making them? Is this really something for me? Is this something that I want? Is this the infrastructure that I want for my life and my relationships?
It's so important, the work that you're doing, because I feel like it's talking to us about our humanness. At the same time, it's acknowledging our very deep relationship with technology. So we're going to move on for a moment, but we'll come back to all of this. Before we move to a discussion with all three of our guests, I'd like to invite you, our students, and also members of our community to participate. I'd like you to write your response to the following question in the chat. With whom do you feel like a we? Maybe it's a person, an animal, a family member, a workplace, a group, a community. I'm sure you find we-ness in lots of places, but let's have it. Name them, name the communities if you feel comfortable, name the animal. Let's have it. Mm. I'm just reading your responses. Um, um, okay. You can keep filling that in. I'm sure that for any one person, there's a lot to think about there. Let's move to a discussion with all three of our guests. As one of you said earlier, the sense, I think it was Adriana said, the sense of shared belonging is never static. So I bet that on some days, as we mentioned in the chat, we feel like a we with this person or group or community, and on other days, maybe not so much. It shifts. What are your thoughts about what popped into the chat just now?
I saw a lot of responses centered around family, and family, of course, means different things to different people, but that too changes. And I think that when we acknowledge that our family can mean different things, it's very liberating and comforting to know that who your family is doesn't have to be your nuclear family or the family you grew up with.
And painful also when that we doesn't feel like it's there for you. Well, maybe not. I mean, that's an assumption on my part. But I imagine that sense of belonging is very important to well-being.
Absolutely. I mean, I'm looking, and as Adriana said, almost everybody said some form of family. I see chosen family in there. I see friends as close as family, but also see some other interesting ones. Those who share my language or my native language. I feel we with my paintings, with art, culture, and I think that's all just incredibly beautiful. And I think that's something I think each of us share as well.
And there's so many dimensions to consider about belonging. As was said, who do I speak for when I use the word we? But yet, we is so important. So let me ask you, what is wise to remember when invoking we?
To do it very choosingly, if that's a word, right? To always understand that even if you're elected to represent a we, there's no way to fully encapsulate all of the different identities and things about ourselves and our collective that you have the authority or the knowledge or the history to speak for. And so in a way, your connection to the we starts with a deeper connection to self and to the I. And that's my perspective.
Yeah, I was thinking about, Lauren, during your presentation about being seen. And I was thinking about the need to be seen. And some would argue that there is a need to be seen and a need to belong. And there's research on that. But by whom do we want to be seen by, right? Sometimes we want not to be seen, and sometimes we want to be we really want to put ourselves in a place to be seen. So what has your research and your work told you about that?
Yeah, I think people have really different relationships to that. And also it depends on the, like you said, there are times you want to be seen and times you don't, and places that you want to be seen and not. I think it's something that we all sort of have an intuitive feeling about. I've noticed with these projects, a lot of times there are different roles people can take in them, and usually people don't have to think too much about what role they want. Either like, I want to be followed, or I want to be the follower, I want nothing to do with this, or I want to be standing over here. And I think that's really important. I feel like one of the dangers with or with just the speed at which things move is this feeling that your agency starts to slip away, that you need to go with whatever's happening, or there's not time to reconsider, or you need to act quickly or miss out on something. And I think we all have an intuition about where our boundaries are, where we want to be with ourselves, where we want to see ourselves with others. And I guess the thing that keeps coming back to me in the work is just like, how do we tap into that? How do we be with our own intuitions about, our personal boundaries and our relationships to other people, instead of letting others tell us what those need to be?
And why do we resist our personal boundaries? Because you're absolutely right. I think we do have intuitions about that. We know when we don't feel comfortable, even if it's not even obvious to ourselves.
Adriana, that makes me think of some of your work in terms of knowing those boundaries and the I part, right? Working with young people.
Yeah.
When you're grappling with this self-identity, but how much of your self-identity is caught up with some of the wanting to belong to a we.
Exactly, right. Exactly. The self-identity really butts up against this need to belong, this fundamental need to be part of a group. I mean, that's why our species has survived, because we do want to have that belonging and that desire to belong. But everybody's different. And some people, we have different degrees of what that even means to belong. Right? Connection means different things to different people. And that's why in the pandemic, for some of us, it's been okay to connect the way that we are connecting right now. And for other people, it's been deeply depressing and isolating. And that really speaks to the varying ways of connecting and belonging.
That's so powerful. I wonder at what point does kind of the balance or the need to belong to a collective we, and then also the kind of self-care, self-identity, setting my boundaries. And it might not be an age thing, right? Or there might be, more intersectional than just age, but at what point does that supersede where you can decide what we's and what groups not that you don't want to belong to, where those boundaries are, or at what point is that, at the greatest risk of being influenced by kind of this fear of isolation that I think we all hold to a degree.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it can be challenging to separate out your need to know your boundaries with just a profound need to have acceptance and belong somewhere. So sometimes you make decisions that are not really on your own behalf, trying to soothe or address something painful or urgent. I was also thinking that, for many people during the pandemic, I mean, some of us met on Zoom all the time, but some people were in group settings where they were forced to be a we, and that wasn't necessarily a safe place to be a we, or to be fully yourself in that context.
That is an incredibly profound point I hadn't thought about. But before running for office, I worked in a Black organized research unit on campus. In fact, the only Black ORU in the UC system is at UCLA and Ralph Bunche Center. And so the ability to be myself in a working environment across a number of cultural lines was was very comfortable. But I've had many previous experiences where there's a part of you that is denied to belong to a collective we, often in a workplace, or settings like that. And that's, or even a classroom, right? And so that's very interesting. I hadn't thought about that.
I feel like another thing maybe I'll just throw out there for the three of you to, maybe you could help thicken this for me, is, you know, we talk a lot about and we see, or we, excuse me, I talk a lot about, and I notice that at least this country, the way that we perform ourselves in various media is so polarized. And there's so much tension around being usurped and by some we that you don't belong to politically, and in terms of identity. And would it be possible just to think together a little bit about how being a we is particularly difficult right now in terms of this political pandemic, racial reckoning, moment.
Well, Vic, do you think that part of the polarization is the need to be such a we, right? Like we are a we and they are a them, right? Like there's no gray area there. And is that part of the extreme?
I think that's probably, as Isaac was talking about earlier, that the possibility of us, there tends to be a other, the them. And that's historical too, right? That's that's not just a feeling. It's written through our histories.
I think part of it. Oh, go ahead, Lauren, please.
Well, I was just gonna say, I think that there's been more, amidst this, there's been more reflection, and I think overall a desire to understand identity better. Some places, in from some points of view, there's more or less desire for that, but I think in general, it's more part of the conversation. And I think there's still a lot of learning to do. So sometimes there are misunderstandings that I think we're still figuring out what some of these words mean, how we understand our own identities. And sometimes there's a desire to say, oh, okay, the label that you use to describe yourself is the label that I use, and therefore that experience must be the same thing, or that our identity must be the same thing. In reality, it's a lot more complex, and it's also much more fluid, right? So how do we make space for saying, I'm part of this we, I'm also part of that we. Those two we's might be at odds with each other, but that's still, parts of me. And there's parts of me that are not, relating to either of those we's,
I think what Lauren said is incredibly profound, right? And that even the labels, I think, matter so much in terms of how we choose to describe individually and collectively who we are, and that you could share the same label, like Black, for example, or woman or otherwise, and still not interpret it the same way. And then you've kind of got labels that encompass the presumption of other labels, like what it means to be a Democrat, right? And so when you talk about polarization right now and those kinds of things, I think the pandemic has definitely fed to it, because you've got this kind of vaccinated, anti-vax. Does vax mean pro-science? Does pro-science then mean you're an environmentalist, right? Like, so it's very, it's very complicated. And one thing that I think a lot of folks don't realize is their rejection of, or not feeling all encompassed by a we. And so I feel like I'm making a personal stance by choosing X, is also belonging to another we of that you subscribe to and could possibly be included in their reflection of themselves. And so it's very tough. It's tough.
It's tough. And also because we feel so definitive, like we believe this, but there are degrees of the we. There are degrees of being a Democrat. There are degrees of being, anything, any identity. And so it feels almost like you're committing to something if you say, I'm we are a part of us, or I am a part of that we. When sometimes you're a little bit of that we, not all of the we.
Yeah. There are some great comments coming into the chat, and I'm really eager to go to hearing from members of our collective audience. But before we do that, I just want to posit one thought, which I think an underlying theme for me in asking this question. Well, of course, we plan to say, how do we build? How do we sustain? How do we love? And who's the we there? But I also have this belief, I have this belief that there's a need to hold this fluid, complex, multiple Venn diagrams of our own selves and commitments and beliefs so that we can be a coalition of difference and still be a we. And I hope that I think my thought in general is in teasing out the problems, maybe it's possible to move into a kind of collective consent of the importance of gathering together in some way.
Yeah.
So.
I think you nailed that, Vicki.
Thanks on that. It sometimes can be a little scary to be spotlit like this and speaking in front of and with so many extraordinary people. So actually, it's time for those extraordinary people to share some of their questions with us. And what I'd like to do is just respond to questions from you, everyone here. You can put them in the chat, I believe you are, or by using the Q&A feature on Zoom. Please know that we encourage all your questions. And of course, in every question is a position, a curiosity. And know that no question is too simple or obvious. It's so often in those obvious questions that we go to the most interesting places. So I think I got a couple of questions here. And please, guests, please respond, willy-nilly. How does the idea that a person is a person because of other people serve to undermine the identity of I, and at the same time inform how we can understand tonight's question, who are we? I don't even know if I understand that question. I'm going to, shall I say it again?
Yeah.
Okay. How does the idea that, in quotes, a person is a person because of other people serve to undermine the identity of I, and at the same time inform how we can understand tonight's question of who are we? And I'd also like to ask whoever put that in the chat, if you could jump into the chat right now and help us to parse, there's multiple parts of that question. And Isaac and Adriana and Lauren, if you'd like to respond, I'm ready for it.
The first thing that comes to mind is that speaks to how dynamic I is and how it speaks to how dynamic we is. That whether it's across development, as I talked about, or whether it's across the day, or it's across where you live. Earlier, we were talking about when we lived in New York. We were different people when we lived in New York than when we live in LA. But that doesn't mean that a part of us isn't still, doesn't still identify with being a New Yorker or the experiences there. So I think it just speaks to how fluid it is to be an I, and that fluidity feeds into who you are as a we.
And my good friend Busi reminds me that Ubuntu is the idea that a person is a person because of other people. Yeah.
Yeah, I think there's something about that relation to other people. And depending on how, what about other people and belonging to that, like I believe foundationally, when we root ourselves in dignity and respect and compassion and kind of the core tenets of what I believe it means to be a person, right? To wake up every day. I think that's where Ubuntu comes from. But if we rise to a different, more superficial level of thinking about our labels and about the key identities we hold, which are very, very important, but we take we put more stock in that than some of the foundational, I don't know, tenets of living. I think that's where the more we do that, the more it gets complicated, and the more we deviate from kind of that collective good we can do for one another. And it's tricky to do because there are so many identities that we all hold that have been completely suppressed for so long and been unable to be seen. And so, of course, I hold this very tightly because this was subjugated and persecuted at one particular point, if not currently. And that's the deepest kind of struggle is what do we do when those things are in conflict, or when we believe that a core part of ourselves is under some sort of inherent attack from those who don't share that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I have another question here, unless anybody else wants to jump in.
Lauren, I thought you were going to jump in.
I mean, I think this relates to what Isaac was saying. I mean, I'm just like constantly having an existential crisis. So it's like I'm getting a little lost in the conversation about like who am I and what are we? 'Cause I'm just like, what is reality? I don't know. But I'm gonna try to stay grounded here. One of the things I come back to a lot, one reason I think a lot about performance is because I'm like, well, I don't really know what I am, but I know there's this performance of me or this performance of we that we're doing all the time. And some of that is necessary, right? Like if I walk up to you and I have zero assumptions at all about any way to interact with you, it takes us a long time to get started. But on the other hand, where does it cross over where my assumptions start to be really limiting? They start to, impose on you a set of expectations and beliefs about who you are with very limited information if I don't know you yet. So yeah, I guess I'm always thinking about that, right? And then beyond just me as an individual, in what ways does the way that we relate to each other as people or as a society or as a community reinforce some of those patterns? And then how do we break them? How do you throw a wrench into things or a glitch, or raise the awareness around the problems that some of these assumptions are making, so that we can start to relate to each other in more expansive or open-minded ways.
Thank you. I have a question for you. How is the construct of we manipulated by those in power to manufacture consent? Yikes.
Yeah, well, it's the idea that you feel as though you are out of the loop if you don't agree. We believe this, right? Actually, there's an interesting verbal tick that has arisen in the English language of adding right to the end of a sentence, because we believe that if someone says yada, 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 right, that you should agree with them. And that's a form of manipulation of the language and of your buy-in and your consent. And we, I think, is another way of doing that.
Funny that Adriana mentioned that, because in my talk, I used that at the end of a sentence in kind of a sarcastic way, right? Where it was like, we are better than them, right? And it was sarcastic in intent, but very real in the way that that is used by many folks. And I think often people stoke on the identities or the ways that we're stratified that are the most polarized at a given time. And they rally around those parts of our shared identities as opposed to all of the many other things. And then we define it at the same time, right? If we're going to rally around what it means to be Black, we're also going to define Blackness in this moment, and then put you into two crises of being part of the collective and challenging your own perception of self. And I think that's something that sometimes is important depending on who the powerful are, right? If the powerful are grassroots movement organizing folks, folks who have been denied access to channels of collective exclamation of we, that's one thing. But another is to just is those who have traditionally held power deciding that we're gonna pit different parts of identity and self and we against each other. And it's complicated. It's tough. I wish I had good answers for all of this. And I think it goes back to some of what has been said in terms of finding yourself and knowing yourself and holding those those truths as close as you can, so that nobody can trigger them at any one point without your consent.
Right.
And
Or
that's
that you can,
a life
or that
process.
you can decide that that aligns with what you believe to be true, or what you want to
Exactly.
see in the world, or what the principles that are your North Star.
Mhm, mhm.
And
Have you
that's
given
hard.
consent? Yeah.
Mhm.
And I guess one of the things I struggle with, right, not personally, but in thinking about this conceptually, is what if my perception of self is in direct conflict with what I am told the we is, right? In a moment. And then how do you grapple with that? And how do you, you know, not fall into radical tendencies that are destructive, not only to yourself, but to others who share many of the identities that you do. And that's tough. We don't have a lot of creative outlets for folks to be honest about how they feel and think and creatively build together.
Yeah, I think a lot of it has to do with how we think about knowledge and who has it and who holds it and who gets to, when you're talking about right, saying who gets to make the statements and then we agree or not. Or when I see power being manipulated, a lot of times it's by kind of making this assertion like, you don't understand, I figured this out. Or if we're, I'm thinking in my realm of technology, it's like, oh, here's this project, it's a black box, you wouldn't understand what's inside, you can't open it up, just take it and use it. And I think that, that the way that we relate to knowledge is specific to our culture, and other cultures have different ways of relating to knowledge. And I think power dynamics are really connected to that, like especially in our like academic culture here, right? Like holding information or knowledge is so much associated with the status or the position that you hold in a space. And yeah, I guess I would question what, who gets to say which knowledge or which description of an experience is the right one.
Exactly. I completely agree. And also by using the word we or ending the sentence with right, you're saying trust me, or I assume you trust me. And that's a big assumption. Historically, some groups shouldn't be trusting other groups. And so you put a person or a group in a position to say, I don't trust that. And that feels antagonistic. Right? That feels like a conflict, that feels like tension. And that sometimes always is typically uncomfortable.
Let's follow up a little bit on this trust piece. I'm seeing in the chat, Jennifer Calderon wrote, the hesitancy of choosing a we is the part that often holds me back to fully express myself on social media and in social events. It's so easy to get misjudged in these scenarios that it's often better to stay silent than to be expressive. I could so relate to that. Your thoughts on this? Especially, in terms of all that social media, like how we put ourselves out there.
Yeah.
We're manufacturing something that stands in for us.
Jennifer, thank you for saying that. That resonates. I'm not on social media for those reasons. I'm afraid of it. I'm afraid of being misjudged or misrepresented or mischaracterized by me. I would be the person misrepresenting my values and my thoughts. So I think that's really real. And I'm curious, Isaac, what you think about that as someone who's in such a public sphere all the time.
And it's funny too, because a lot of elected officials, they have a communications person on their team who runs their social media accounts. They're very dry and boring, and you get nothing from following them.
You could never be boring.
I could be, but I run my own Twitter account, I run my own Instagram account, and sometimes they are dry and boring, but by and large, it is my authentic self to the best that I can be. But every day, before I type a tweet, I do have to think about how this interacts with certain communities. And what I will say, just to be incredibly candid, despite the fact that we're recording, is there was a large global conflict that happened in the middle of my election that I had thoughts on, nuanced, thoughtful thoughts on, that I felt like I just could not weigh in on publicly, one way or another, without taking some sort of intense backlash because of my now affiliation with some we. And that was a very troubling feeling, right? And I've actually thought about it a lot since. When I make the same decision today, and I struggle with that. And so, Jennifer, you raised an excellent point. I would say if you're being your true authentic self, it's also just hard to put it into 140 characters. And so, as Adriana said, you're gonna misrepresent yourself even, because I just don't have the length to be as comprehensive as I'd like to be on any particular topic. And so that's also something to keep in mind with social media. If you can't get all of your thoughts out, then you might want to hold some of them back until you have a better platform, like a 10 question series or some other space where you can truly vent and just be open.
I appreciate having a representative who can share those thoughts, you know, where there's also an authenticity about the complexity of being an elected. I also want to acknowledge that Carol McDowell says in the chat, and this is something I think that you all have spoken about too, that this notion of a true identity is problematic, and that in fact we're always in process and in relationship, in everyday conversation and social media. There is no static you. I think that's something that Lauren reminded us of in every case of her work. I want to share something else that came through. As a woman of color, I find myself code switching based on the level of comfort that I have with the group with whom I'm speaking. And my fear of being diminished intellectually if I step outside of my professional persona. My guess is that many groups have their own version of this phenomena. Is there any hope that we as a people can be more generous in our acceptance of the otherness of our fellow persons? So beautifully put. And there it is. Is there any hope? Or what is the work that we do? What can we do?
Yeah, I think we're getting there. I agree. I could switch all the time, whether I'm in an academic space or in a research space or with my family. And it's so fluid now. I don't even think about it except when I'm asked to reflect on it. And I think these discussions we're having about inclusion and acknowledgement of diversity is part of that, is maybe thinking about removing that need to code switch. I think some people don't mind code switching. It's kind of fun to wear different identities, but with others, it's very exhausting. So again, there's no we, right? There's no collective response to that.
That is, go ahead, Lauren, I'm sorry.
Yeah, I think a lot of it has to do with time. A lot of it feels like more and more we're trying to be as efficient, as connected as possible. But if you actually leave space for people to not just assume that they're going to code switch into the frame in which you're working, then that means there's times where you have to slow down and speak slower because maybe the language you're speaking is not the first language of someone else. There's times where people have to say, actually, I don't know that reference. What does that mean? Explain that to me.
Right.
There's times where people say, I don't have access. I can't hear you. I can't read the thing that you're showing me. We need to discuss, what is this? Instead of just assuming a shared understanding, I feel like we need to have time to talk about what your opinion is and what mine is and come to a conclusion. All that takes time, which seems to be sort of the opposite of a lot of the capitalist working structures that we're operating within. So I guess my hope is that I don't know what the hope is, but I think that that's important to acknowledge, because I feel like I've been in a lot of spaces where the intention is really good, but then people are still like, oh, but I'm in a hurry. Like, I want that, but also like, let's keep going at the same speed. And I think sometimes these things are directly at odds. It is the time that gives us the space to understand and more fully express ourselves.
That question hit something for me, just in terms of thinking about code switching is not just language. right? And it's funny thing because I was here last year, right? And I worked on campus, and so Vusi and many others, I wear a chain every day, and whether it's out or tucked in depends on who I think I'm going to be in front of,
Right.
right? My partner has a bracelet made out of this chain, and last year it was out. I wasn't in office. This year I'm in office. We tucked it in, despite the fact that there's a strong part of me that knows this is a safe place to just be my truest self. And I think that's kind of what that's an area of growth even for me still today. And I thought I was really past a lot of that, just staying true to who I am in all spaces. But what does it mean to put your best self forward? And so thank you for asking that question. But I do have hope, and I think everybody should untuck their chain and live in that hope, because I think there's always that room for us to grow in tolerance and acceptance of challenging what we believe the ideal of X person or X identity should be.
I agree, Isaac. Your chain are my gold hoop earrings, which I didn't wear today, but I have huge earrings that I wear, and sometimes I wear them, sometimes I don't. And it really just depends. And it's so interesting how you make that conscious decision.
Well, and I think we're, these are such, I want to capture all of the things that you're saying this evening and carry them with me. And here we're talking a lot about the courage, the individual courage, but also there's something collectively that individually I think we need to commit ourselves to, right? Which is to make the space for people to be courageous. And I wonder if you have some thoughts about that and how you do that. To make room for other people's courage to be full.
I think you've got to challenge yourself. There are many, many identities and complexities that we don't all hold. And I think whenever we're confronted with that in a very open way, it triggers an us versus them feeling that then sometimes manifests in behavior, and whether it's implicit or otherwise, there's a deeper self-understanding that you have to do in terms of tolerance and appreciating when those kind of things come into what you might have perceived as conflict before, but in fact it's an opportunity for growth. And I think we've got to do that individually, and we've got to do that collectively, and hopefully that can lead to some of the hope we were talking about. And I think we definitely can. And I challenge myself daily to do that and those around me. And I think that's somehow we move forward.
I want to we're starting to move towards a place to tie things up. I wonder, we have such an extraordinary group of people with us that we can't literally see right now. But I wonder, those of you in the chat, if you'd like to take a moment to just share your own thoughts about how do we better without sacrificing our differences and our complexity? How do we do it better? Please just write it in for us. Yes, thank you, Taylor, Kim. Yeah, these are moving so quickly. I want to read some out loud. I think being aware of who your we is by recognizing your privileges and identities. Being present in the conversation and listening. Stop trying to solve or fix other people. We define a we focuses on the complexities of what it means to be human. spending time with other people and not necessarily from our own backgrounds, presenting an open mind when communicating, by standing up for those who can't. Here's a really great practice: acceptance of fluidity, instability, dynamism. And we have here, I think the question, who are we, inevitably connotes and asks what it means for us to work together given our differences, and not acknowledging that might be the first step. These are so beautiful. Walk humbly, listen, and then listen, and then listen, pause, and maybe ask for permission. We don't have to go far to find what we need, do we? By being vulnerable. Yeah, maybe that's part of that chain there, Isaac. Yeah. And believing that you'll be caught and held. Mm-hmm. So we really are, before we close this up, I'd like to ask each of you, our guests, to briefly share any last thoughts you have. You may want to leave it with our extraordinary gathering, because there's so many beautiful thoughts here, but I also want you to have an opportunity to share your last thoughts.
I'll just say that we is not simple. When we first started having conversations and exchanges about this panel, it seemed simple. It seemed like an easy ask, but it's not. It's nuanced, and it's powerful, and it's complicated.
Yeah, I think I would add to that. I'm reading the things in the chat and they all sound wonderful. But I think this stuff can be really hard. And when there's actual meaningful change happening, change can be uncomfortable, or it takes figuring out. In the past year, I just saw so many communities really break down or have moments of implosion, or not be able to connect, or think that they were on the same page and realize that they weren't. And I think that's the work, is figuring out how do you come back from that, or separate and build something else, or repair the harm that's been done. I think there's not that much. A lot of times we're very aspirational, to accept others and listen, and I think those are important. But when you really internalize, what does that mean? That means like shifting and reorienting stuff in yourself and in the communities you're a part of, and that can be difficult. So I guess the thought that I want to leave is just, if you're hitting those moments where it feels hard, or it's not working, it doesn't mean that it's failing or that you shouldn't try. Back to the comments of like, I'm kind of afraid to say anything. I think it's the trying despite it not always working that gives me the most hope.
Thank you for that, Lauren. And that, I have to say, personally really hits home for me. Thank you.
I really don't have much to add that hasn't been said by the incredible panelists. I'm grateful to have shared space with you, Adriana and Lauren. Growth is not linear, and neither is progress always. And there's so much othering and them, and there always has been. And I think the deeper we connect with kind of a greater sense of we, and kind of a shared sense of who we'd like to be, I think the closer we'll be to getting there. And I'm so grateful for this question and for this entire series. Y'all keep doing this every year. It's important.
Thank you, Isaac. Thank you, everyone. I have a couple of words to say before we close this out. I want to thank you all for being here with us tonight and for consideration of who we are. And I want to say that we have had 3 extraordinary guests. It couldn't have been a more wonderful way to start the fall, and also that we have had an extraordinary group gathered with us tonight with so much wisdom. Students, there you are here. Remember that your next action due before Tuesday, 5 p.m. is to post in our forum. Here you will formulate your own response to the public conversation that we have been having. We want to hear what you've been musing about, synthesizing, drawing connections between, to hear disparate ideas, and also the way you're reading subtext. What were the things that were almost discussed and we just missed? We hope, we mean me and the TAs, hope you will share your lived experience and look forward to reading your responses on the forum, and that's on CCLE. This concludes this evening's program. We hope you'll join us again next week for So How Do We Begin? Same time, but new links. So if you're here tonight, you need to RSVP for next week. To learn more about the series or to RSVP, visit arts.ucla.edu/10questions. And again, if you'd like to stay and briefly meet our guests, just raise your Zoom hand and we'll have you join us. To everyone else, thank you. And until next week, good night.